So, before we start, is there anything that you would like to tell your fans about your life since you created Wizardry? Is there anything in particular that you'd like to share?
Well, I mean, I've just gotten along with the process of living my life and doing things that interest me. I mean, that was the great benefit I got out of Wizardry, was that it gave me enough money to basically be able to choose what I want to do based on how much it interested me. And so I've basically spent the last 30 years doing just that, just doing interesting, fun things.
Oh, that's great. I mean, I really like to hear that because, you know, with something like Wizardry and with some of the, the issues I've heard over the years, with changing of hands and things like that, I've often worried that, you didn't get, your fair share of what was due to you. So that's good to hear. During the creation of the original Wizardry game, I've read on other sites and through other interviews that you were mainly the software designer. Is that correct?
I did most of the coding, yes.
Great. And I know that there's been a lot of ports of the game over the year. I think it came out originally on Apple II, and I know there's a PC version. I think there was even a Nintendo Entertainment System version. Did you have any hand in migrating these, or were they ported over by the developers of that specific platform?
In some cases, I did work closely with the developers. For example, the PC version and the versions for some of the Japanese home computers at the time and the Commodore 64 version, I worked very closely with the people who basically re-implemented the UCSD-P system, which was the operating system and interpreter that Wizardry was built on top of. That was all re-implemented for various different processors and hardware configurations. And I also did a lot of work in internationalizing the program. So, for example, in later versions of the games, all of the text was constructed from templates in a data file, so that you just change the template and you could completely change the language of the game to French or Japanese or German, whatever you needed.
Of the different versions, for example, you mentioned the Commodore 64 and the PC version. Do you have a favorite version? Is there one specific release that you thought was, the best presentation?
I really have two. One was when we redid Wizardry into the sort of Lisa Macintosh style Windows, which I figured out how to do that. I figured out a neat little hack to get that to work on the Apple II, and got the first version of that running in this like all weekend long, no sleep coding marathon. And it all came together just perfectly. But the version that I'm most proud of was the actual Macintosh version that was natively coded for Macintosh, which I did that work. And that was the version that I really think I had the most fun working on.
That was actually the first version of the game I encountered. If we're talking about the same one, the old black and white Mac with the different windows. In fact, I remember, if it's the one I'm thinking of, all party members were sort of in one window in the tavern, and you just clicked their character icon and drag them into the party. Is that the one?
Yep.
I love that one. That is my favorite also.
Well, back in those days, you had to actually buy a Lisa, which was the predecessor machine to the Macintosh, because that was the only machine you could use to program the Macintosh. And so getting that game to work on the 128K Mac was a real challenge. In fact, I actually found one of the first bugs, if not the first bug in the Macintosh ROM, and had to call in a favor with some friends at Apple to get a hot fix to it, a patch to it, so that I could continue developing the game.
Speaking of, the original scenario, of course, the the two main characters in the backstory of the game, Trevor and Wardna, your name backwards and then the name of Andrew, the other creator backwards, Wardna. Were there any other monsters or characters in the game that had any kind of hidden meaning? An example might be on the first level of the maze. There's Murphy's Ghost, sort of a notorious monster in the game. Is there a real life Murphy, or is that based on anything? Or
yes, actually there is. Murphy and some other people were the original playtesters of the original Apple Basic Wizardry game that Andy Greenberg wrote, and they also tested several of the early Wizardry scenarios. There's like 3 or 4 people that helped Andy out on that, and I believe most of them ended up being monsters or features or mentioned in the game. Then there's the Temple of Kant. Kant was a D&D character of mine, and Boltac was the D&D character of a friend of mine who played at Cornell in the big Cornell D&D campaign in the mid '70s. His name was John Ankrum. I've lost touch with him, but he was quite a character, and he really put a lot of himself into this Boltac the dwarf character, and so I put him in the game in that way to sort of honor that.
I see. And the name Gilgamesh, is that just a reference to the Gilgamesh epic?
Yes.
Okay. Speaking of strange words and things, the first few scenarios of the game, all of the magic spells were not necessarily obvious to someone who didn't have a manual. For example, Millwall was a light spell. Low Millwall was an enhanced version of the light spell. Where did these words come from? Are they rooted in Latin, or just kind of just made up by you guys?
We like to say that those words and a lot of the other words like Lil Gammon and stuff like that are mock Welsh. What we tried to do with the spell names was invent a sort of a language that had some sort of syntax. So you noted there's halito, la halito, ma halito, that had some regularity to it. But the real reason why they ended up being that way, and why there are a couple of deviations from what the consistency, is because that was a way to save a lot of memory in the actual game code. Because instead of checking what you typed against the list of strings, what we actually did was hash what you typed in down to a single 15 or 16-bit number, and then just check the number, which turns out to save a lot of space.
Personally, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And there were a couple of collisions that, like, after I tried 5 or 6 hashing algorithms and different parameters, and there, no matter what, I never could get it down to where there were no collisions. So I just said screw it, and I changed a couple of the spell names to make it so that the damn things wouldn't collide.
Well, I think it adds a lot of atmosphere to the game, to be honest with you. It made it really unique and kind of cryptic, and I think it just fit in great. I've always been a fan of those. Moving on, the fourth scenario is considered by some, or I've seen it said that it's considered to be one of the most difficult PC games of all time. In fact, if you manage to complete the game, as a player, you're presented with a phone number that at one time you could call, I guess for bragging rights or whatever. Did anyone ever actually call the number?
Oh, sure.
How long did it take?
Actually, I think we had people who got through it in less than a week.
Wow.
But, it may have taken a little longer than that, but that's because at the time, people couldn't collaborate on the internet.
True.
because there basically wasn't an internet then. There were bulletin boards, but they're not really national. Oh no, wait a minute. CompuServe was up at that time, so I think people were actually working on CompuServe to try and solve the game. But our goal with that was to make it as difficult as possible without any of the puzzles just being unfair. And we also wanted just to try as many different strange things as we could. And the credit for almost all of that goes to the scenario designer, a gentleman named Ro Adams, who really put his heart and soul into the game.
Okay. Side question to that: when people called, what were they greeted with? Did they actually get to speak with you guys, or was it a congratulatory recording or something like that?
I really don't remember. I think it was just like our second phone number or something like that, and they'd call up and we'd just say, "Hey, congratulations, well done. Don't tell anybody how you did it," that sort of thing. There were multiple endings to the game, so there were different ways to win and different ways in which the game expressed itself at the end, which I thought was kind of neat.
And that was the last game that you had a direct hand in, is that correct?
Yes.
The later titles, I know, like I think 5, 6, and 7 were created by D.W. Bradley, and Surtech as a whole. Did you really have any interest in those titles once you were done? Did you play them at all?
No, I actually never did. I helped David, get going on how to use the code base, and he made his own extensions to it as well. But at that time, my interests were going out into other directions, and I was having disagreements with my partners, and so we negotiated, to go our own separate ways. And so after that, I didn't really have much to do with Wizardry.
I understand. Wizardry 5 was similar in many respects to your games, but of course the later games were completely different. Do you feel that the later games, 6, 7, and eventually 8, were true at all to your original vision?
I have absolutely no idea. I've never played them.
Okay. Well, moving on. After the demise of Surtech and after they closed their doors, I understand at some point the Wizardry franchise was picked up by a Japanese developer or publisher. Do you have any insight into how that transfer of ownership happened? Were you approached, or was your involvement? Were you offered involvement in any way?
No, I no longer had any rights to Wizardry. I don't really know the details of that situation, whether or not they bought it or it was a license or things like that. So I really couldn't comment on it.
Okay. I've been curious about that for years. Now, since that time, there's been a lot of Japan-only Wizardry games that have been created, and a lot of these actually kind of harken back to your original scenarios and just look and feel from what I've seen. Are you kind of flattered by that? I mean, well, I guess you've already answered, you don't receive any royalties really for those offshoots anymore, is that correct?
No. I mean, the way I've always looked at it is that Wizardry is sort of like one stop in a continuum of games. We tried to take the best parts of games that we'd played and reinterpret them on this new environment that we had, these little tiny home computers. We owed a big debt both to Dungeons and Dragons and also to a lot of the games that had been developed in the early 70s on the Plato system, which basically is where everything you love about internet gaming was invented between 1970 and 1977. It was all invented on Plato. Go check Wikipedia on it. You'll just be amazed at what they were doing back then. But, and in turn, other people have seen what we've done and seen what Richard Garriott did in Ultima and what other people were doing. and they've put their own twist on it and taken it into different places and made it their own. And then people have taken what they've done, and so it's sort of passed down through the generations, and that's as it should be. If there are things that people like about my games, that's great. But I don't view it as like, oh, I did this great, incredible, wonderful thing. I view it as I did something interesting enough that other people were inspired to do their own interesting things. And as far as I'm concerned, that really there is the greatest compliment that people can give me.
That's great. I understand after your Wizardry days were over, you briefly worked on the design of what would have been a multiplayer online game. Is that right? Do I have that right?
Yeah. Basically, I actually really moved to Japan to work on the design and implementation of what would have been one of the first, if not the first, MMOs. I both worked on both the software and the hardware necessary to support it. But unfortunately, the funding for the project fell through about a year after I got to Japan. But at the same time, this little joke company that we'd started to release anime in the US had kind of taken off. So my sort of career path took a bit of a left-hand turn, and I started doing that and got really interested in Japanese film and doing translation and dialogue editing and production work. And I ended up living there for 6 years. I got married. My kids were born there, but eventually we came back to the States, and we've been living here for about 15 years now.
That's amazing. I kind of find that in a way kind of poetic because, as we were talking about a moment ago, the Wizardry franchise is now mainly handled in Japan, and a lot of the game is very anime in its artwork. So I find that to be a little interesting. Talking about MMOs, of course, right now in Japan there is an online Wizardry MMO, and I hear that Sony Online Entertainment has actually got the rights to it, and they're going to be bringing it stateside maybe by the end of the year. Being an MMO player and the father of Wizardry, are you at all interested in looking at it or perhaps even trying it out?
Oh, I'll probably try it out just to see what they did with it. I do enjoy playing MMOs. I don't know if I'd become a fanatical player at it, but it would certainly be fun to see what directions they took. And but unfortunately, part of the problem when you've actually done work in the business is you tend to be overly critical. Yeah. You really have to stomp that down and say, because you always look at it and say, well, I would have done that differently. And of course you are always right. But it's always interesting to see what other people do. I was very interested to see, for example, what happened with the Old Republic.
Yes.
So I played that for about a month, and I enjoyed it for what it was. But
that's about as long as I lasted with it myself.
Yeah, it's the thing that really got to me about that game was that I think they made a couple of mistakes in the way the social environment worked for the players. It doesn't really push the players together, and I am really, really sensitive to that because the MMO that I do play a lot of is EVE Online, and EVE is just such an amazingly social game, such that if any MMO that I try, if it doesn't have that depth of social interaction between the players, then I'm saying why am I playing an MMO? I'm really playing a single player game.
I understand. personally, my wife and I, we played Final Fantasy XI and now Final Fantasy XIV, which are MMOs, for many years, and it's a social aspect that kept us playing, to be honest with you. Some of the gameplay in those titles is very frustrating and tedious at times, so I totally understand that. Really, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, nothing.
My last question for you is, since Wizardry 8 was released and Surtech closed its doors or whatever happened, with that, the Wizardry franchise, has kind of been silent here in the U.S. or in the West. A lot of players still remember the games. In fact, when you talk about RPGs, Wizardry is one of the first ones that comes up in conversation. With the upcoming release of Wizardry Online, I suspect that there may be a renewed interest in the series, and if so, let's say someone were to decide to re-release them or update them. If you were asked, would you have any interest in being involved in a revival project or anything like that?
Well, I guess my answer would be it would depend upon the circumstances. I mean, like I said, the great thing that Wizardry did for me is it gave me the ability to just work on projects that I find interesting. So if the particular thing that I was asked to do was something I said, oh, that's interesting, then sure, I'd do it. But I would have to very carefully consider, whether or not it would be the right thing for me to do, not only right for me, but right for the other people working on the game. You always have to be a little bit careful about that sort of thing.
I understand. Well, I do really want to thank you for taking time out of your day to discuss this with me. This is a new podcast, that has not, hit the light of day yet, and I really appreciate your time. Before I let you go, is there anything you'd like to say, or anything you'd like to discuss or ask of me?
No, except, log on to EVE Online and look me up. I'm Trevor Daydew, which is Robert Woodhead spelled backwards in the game. I'm actually, sort of well known because I'm a member of the Council of Stellar Management, which is this elected group that goes to Iceland twice a year to yell at the developers and tell them what idiots they are. So I'm sort of an internet spaceship politician right now. Just in my basics thing I tell people is, play the games you love, enjoy them for what they are, and if you find an opportunity to do something creative on your own, go for it. I mean, podcasts are a perfect example of this. So you're doing something creative that expresses something that you really enjoy. And I just wish everybody got that opportunity or more specifically seized it when it presented itself, because doing that 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago now, changed my life. And, I mean, I never expected to make any money writing computer games, maybe pay off my school loans, And when Wizardry hit the market, my school loans got paid off the first month. Wow. Yeah. Well, that was back in the day. I mean, school loans weren't as big as horrible as they are now. But, so that's the advice I always give to people is, just try doing something you like. If it succeeds, great. And if it doesn't, you had fun doing it.
Well, thank you. I certainly appreciate, like I said, the time, and I hope, when the podcast comes out, you'll give it a listen, and we look forward to updates from you in the future.
No problem. Take care.